8. When I think of gentleness, I think of how I would hold a baby chick, or how I might pick up a caterpillar if I didn't want to hurt it. Except that gentleness is more about how we treat other people. It's a part of faithfulness, kindness, goodness, and the others. If we are kind to others, we'll be gentle too. If we are good to others, we'll be gentle as well. And if we are patient with others, we'll be gentle to them every bit as much. Jesus Christ himself was by far the best example of gentleness in the whole Bible. He even said to himself in Matthew 11, verse 29, "Take my yoke upon you, and learn of me, for I am meek and lowly in heart, and ye shall find rest unto your souls." And yet Jesus never backed away from the truth. He always told it like it was, but he was never mean or too rough. For example, he told many people how to be saved, but always in a gentle way with a gentle voice. One of the few times Jesus spoke in a non-gentle way happened when he drove the money changers out of the temple. But they were doing evil things in God's own house, so he had the right to be angry. In fact, he had the duty to do what he did. This proves that Jesus was not afraid to be strong when he needed to be. The trick is in knowing when, so he can be gentle and kind at all other times. Also, some people say that being tough at the right time is really the kindest thing you can do in the long run, but that's another huge subject. Mr. Morgan smiled and nodded, and since no one else could add anything, we moved on to the last of the fruits. "Who has self-control?" said Mr. Morgan. "I sure hope I do," said Joey Falcon. "I need it most every day." As with so many others in the room, Joey had done his homework and had it nailed. 9. Self-control is also like so many of the other fruits, he went on. It means that you don't always slap somebody in the shoulder when they bump into you. You also don't do some of the mean and spiteful things like telling lies or sweeping their books that come so naturally when someone else bugs you. Naturally, that is, if you don't have God in you. But if you do have His spirits inside you, you learn to stop and think about everything you are about to say or do. You want to make sure it's the right way to show other people who you really are, how you really feel inside, with God in there too. He himself stopped to think for a moment, and Mr. Morgan almost jumped in, but Joey wasn't quite finished yet, even before he opened up his Bible. God is not about smashing around like a wild bull that's had a rope thrown around his neck, but won't give up until he breaks a few arms and legs. He's more like a trained racehorse that runs full speed only when the time is right. Along with all that horse's other training, he's learned self-control. Anything else is wild and crazy. You can't be self-control and out of control at the same time. I think that the story of Daniel gives us a great lesson in the value of self-control. In the first chapter of the book of Daniel, he and three of his friends were taken by the king Nebuchadnezzar to Babylon in order to serve the king. They were also expected to eat rich foods and drink wines from the king's table. But Daniel and his friends had enough self-control to resist eating what they knew would not be good for them, especially since they were still young and hadn't finished growing up. Here is what Daniel said to the people in charge in Daniel chapter 1 verses 12 and 13. "Prove thy servants, I beseech thee, 10 days, and let them give us pulse, vegetables to eat, and water to drink. Then let our countenances be looked upon before thee, and the countenances of the children that eat of the portion of the king's meat, and as thou seest, deal with thy servants." You probably know how this story ended too. After the 10 days had passed, Daniel and his friends felt better and looked healthier than all the other young men who were eating rich foods and drinking wine. But only because those 4 young men all had self-control. By the time Joey finally finished, Mr. Morgan had almost lost his own self-control. "Wow!" he said, his head bobbing up and down and his smile spread out about as wide as any I'd ever seen. "You folks have really got it. You've really got it. And the best thing about all this is the way you've tied these things together. Because," and here he paused for several seconds with his finger in the air, "because you've caught on to one of the biggest pieces of truth in the whole Bible, and you've come back to it over and over. These fruits that the Apostle Paul talks about are not natural to any of us without God's Spirit living inside us. At the same time, they don't all explode out of us like pieces of dynamite that are set off instantly when we ask God to come in. They grow and develop from one another, which means that you start with one, and that leads into the next one, and that leads into the next one, until you're like the tree in the orchard that starts with one little bud, then a few little blossoms, and then a whole huge offering of fruits that are as perfectly developed, as ripe, and as ready to be enjoyed as they can possibly be. The fruits of the Spirit develop in a logical order, budding out with love and blossoming through all the others until, by the time you've been at it for a while, things like faithfulness, gentleness, and self control can seem almost automatic. Not quite, of course. Very few good things are automatic in us unless we work on them. But it feels easier and more natural as we move ahead. He paused and waited a moment. Any questions on all this? Not a single hand went up. I had the feeling that everyone in the room had lots to think about. Perfect, said Mr. Morgan. Let me close with a prayer and let's wrap it up for tonight. No homework for next week. We'll do a little review and then start on a whole new subject. Cake and I both ate 2 or 3 cookies apiece before we walked back home that night, but I had so much to think about I still wasn't very hungry.